Hey everyone, it is Marc Sabatella from Outside Shore Music here, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is our regular session where we talk about some aspect of creating music, all the creative acts of music making, from composition, arranging, improvisation, etc. And uh, yeah, this is. At some point I'm going to get that speech just like totally down and have it the same every time, but whatever. I like winging it too. So, yes, I'm still in my current office. Things are looking good. I will apologize in advance if I end up having to check a text or something if something important comes in. But yeah, lots of things are moving along so that I think by next week's session I will be broadcasting from a different location. That is the theory. All right. So as always for the time being, we're going to be looking at counterpoint today. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to start by looking at one of the projects from the two voice thing, and I'm going to use that to launch into talking about three-part counterpoint. So first of all, hopefully everyone who's in the course has started going through the lessons on the three-part counterpoint. And even if you're not like all caught up on the exercises from two-part, don't worry about it. Just start watching some of the videos, but go ahead and do exercises. You don't have to do like a whole page of each species. Just do one just to get some practice. You're going to get plenty more practice going ahead. Sora, thank you. And yes, absolutely. I will take a look at the thing you're talking about. And I was actually going to talk about it in the context of another piece as well. So I know exactly what you're talking about, Sora. And in fact, maybe I'll start with that because that way I remember. So anyhow, yeah, we're going to look at this transition from two-part counterpoint to three-part counterpoint. And again, I'm going to recommend that everyone try to do some exercises, at least one of each species. Try your hand at the project. For this next section here on counterpoint in three or more parts, we're not going to have a whole ton of exercises. I started a discussion already. Hopefully you saw it on a Bach three-part invention, also known as sinfonia or pronounced sinfonia, depending on who you believe. So we're just looking at it and trying to understand to what extent the stuff that we've been talking about applies. And we're going to talk through that. We'll talk through another example, and then I'll give us a little project. But there's not going to be like a ton of exercises and stuff here. So I'm going to address what Sora is talking about here first. So that's over here. And this isn't the one, but I think this is. All right. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about and then show you like an example. So this is what came up on this particular piece, and it's a common situation that comes up, and I've made this comment a lot. In fact, I did a whole video on it that I posted in the In Theory section in the newsletter a couple of weeks ago. But let's take a look at this line right here. So there's a couple things to notice about this line. One is, if I took this first measure up an octave, we see it's really one big long scalar line, right? There just happens to be what we call an octave displacement in the middle of it. And in one of the lessons in the course, I comment that those octave displacements are quite common because they help, even if you have a line that logically speaking is just a descending scale like this one, is really just a descending line logically, it's still good to have that leap somewhere within it so that the range of that line isn't too big. Because if you're trying to write counterpoint and you're trying to keep every voice in its own lane, you kind of want to keep each voice to, within an octave or so. Maybe that's not a point that I made explicitly before, but there you go. It's I'm saying it explicitly now. You try to keep each voice within, an octave or so they're not going all over the place and possibly crossing each other and then making imitation complicated also. So the idea of octave displacement is just that we take a line like that and somewhere within it make the jump. The question is, where do we make the jump? So my observation is typically we make the jump in one of two places, and those two places are usually the same place. Either I say we do it after we land on a strong beat, or we do it after landing on a strong consonance. By a strong consonance here, I mean basically the root of a chord change. It doesn't have to be that, but so let's take a look at what's happening here. I'm going to play it as written. So, the downbeat here is a strong beat, obviously. Downbeat is as strong a beat as you get, but it's also potentially, it's not actually a chord change. We kind of have an A minor chord happening already, and this is just restating that A minor chord. So there's not actually a chord change there, but it is a strong beat. And it is certainly a consonant, right? There's a third or 10th. So my observation is that that jump typically happens after that. So let's listen to it both ways. Actually, I got to keep going. Now we're going to hear it the other way. The other way is I'm going to land on the A in the lower octave, then I'm going to jump up. My point is that we are going to leap after arriving on that strong beat. So it's a subtle difference, and if you don't hear it the first time, that's fine. You can play around with it, but I'm going to do it again. So I land on the low A, then I jump up. It's not like a rule. You're not going to go to jail if you don't do it. I always have to make that observation. But it's a common feature of melodies that they typically do that. They land on a strong beat before leaping, or they land on a consonant before leaping. You can certainly see also that that B is basically a passing tone trying to get to the A because it's dissonant against the high A. So it's a passing tone that the resolution is sort of interrupted by that leap. So these things all work together. Change of chord, consonants, strong beat, resolving a passing tone. All of these things typically come together to tell you where your leap should happen, and it's after that A, not going into that A. So I want to compare and contrast that with another example that I happen to have queued up because we have been talking about it. Where is it? Dang it. Let me take a quick look here. It's... Where's my IMSLP? Ah, here it is. Okay. So this is a piece from that Fitzwilliam Virginal book, right? So this is the Virginal book that people have been talking about. They wanted to be looking at examples from it, and I can see why. There's a lot of great stuff going on it, and we'll talk more about this piece going forward. But I want to talk about, this is one of the pieces that was posted. Bob had posted his, he had entered this into MuseScore. It's a slightly different version in a different key, but it's largely the same piece. But let's take a look at this line here and see if it doesn't do every single last thing. So check out that line starting there at number 2. Land on the strong beat, then leap down. So here we landed on beat 2. It's not a strong beat, it's a weak beat, but it's a beat, right? It didn't leap in the middle of a beat. Furthermore, it was the consonants that completed that chord. And then it was able to leap. Let's keep going. So this line here lands on the strong beat along with the consonants, then does the leap. Land on the strong beat, which is also the chord change as it was before, then do our leap, right? Land on beat 3, which is a strong beat, then do a little leap. Right? So this line it's oozing that concept of landing on a strong beat, landing on a consonant, landing on a chord change, then breaking the direction change, right? So this is an observation that I have often made before. And Colleen, if you don't mind, I'm going to use mention an example that I remember having come up in jazz improvisation. We often talk about trying to target the third of a chord, trying to land on the third of a chord. We're improvising, so like if I was improvising over that chord progression, maybe have a D minor, and then try to land on an E on the downbeat of that next measure. It's a common thing we do in jazz, try to land on thirds. But what we don't want is this. And then just sort of teleport to that E. In other words, I don't want my line to be going. I don't want it to be going down and then suddenly jump to that third. I don't want that. I want my line to lead into that third. So that my line is leading into that note. So regardless of whether that note is going to be the third or the root or the fifth or whatever it is, the idea of creating a line that leads into the downbeat. A drummer I used to work with used to talk about the gravity of beat one, and that beat one is like this solid mass that like pulls things towards it, and all the lines should have this gravity going into beat one. And he would talk about it in terms of drumming, but it applies to everything. So anyhow, that's that. And yeah, I mean, you when you're making up your melody, you make your melody do what you want. But these things, I think, if you've never thought about them before, you don't realize the extent to which this is just a really common thing in melodies, whether they're, kind of early Baroque melodies like this one. Or whether they're Renaissance melodies, or whether they're Romantic era melodies, or jazz melodies, that idea that we're going to create that gravity into beat one, into the chord change, into the strong beats, that it's really prevalent in music. And if your lines don't do that, there's something that feels perhaps a little off about them. And you want to break that assumption sometimes, but hopefully not too often. All right, so what I'm going to do now is take a little jump over to another piece here. And so this is Graham's project here, which he just posted recently, and I've only looked at briefly. It's really nice. It's got a lot of good stuff going on, and I want to use it to also connect to that Bach piece and make an observation about that. So we have a two-voice piece here, and I'll go ahead and let MuseScore.com play it, and you all tell me if the audio comes through well enough. I'll put my other headphones on. All right, so lots of nice stuff going on there, Graham. And so my first comment on any of these projects is always going to be, how well do the two parts work together? Do they feel like they're, first of all, part of the same piece? That's like an important observation that I haven't even made yet. But this piece is the most shining example of that I can think of. It's in 6/8, and that rhythm, ba-ba-da-bum, right, that rhythm, that's in what I assume is the original melody, he uses that same rhythm, right? That same basic rhythmic pattern. Now, of course, in 6/8, there's only so many rhythms, and that's going to be one of them. But it's still like not every piece has the same rhythmic character. And hopefully, it's going to be the case that while you're writing your counterpoint, you have the original melody in mind, and you're coming up with counterpoint that somehow reflects the character of the original piece. And I think this is, as I said, the most brilliant shining example of that, because the rhythms are so distinctive. If you're writing a piece in 4/4 or 3/4 or like a Renaissance kind of 4/2 thing, and you're just dealing with quarter notes and eighth notes, it's hard to be distinctive. Hold on to that thought when we flip over to Bach, and maybe remind me of that. When I said it's hard to be distinctive, remind me about that when we flip over to Bach. But when you're dealing with 6/8, right off the bat, we have a distinctive rhythm. And then he works that into his accompaniment quite a lot. So that is my first comment. And then the next comment is going to be, well, do you move and do distribute the motion properly? I'm loving this term, distributed motion. That's the term I used in the video that I posted for the newsletter last week. Was it last week or was it this week? I lose track of time. Okay, that's good to know that it was still a little quiet, but I'll just play. I'll play parts of it now on the piano. The idea of distributed motion, the idea that some voice should be moving at all times, other than when you want the motion to stop. So when Graham's got that going really well here too. That first beat, the top voice is moving, the bottom voice is not. Then for, a little while they both sit there, but only for like 2/8, and then top voice is moving, bottom voice not, then top voice moving, bottom not, and then now it's the bottom voice moving while the top doesn't. So this idea that when you see one voice moving, try to put something slower moving against it. When you see a long note, try to put something faster moving against it. This is a general principle of polyphonic writing. It's part of the idea of counterpoint, and specifically it is that idea of polyphony, different rhythms happening at the same time. So that's how you're going to achieve it in a nutshell, is by making sure that when one voice moves, the other one doesn't, and vice versa. And then sometimes they can both move together. And we're going to look at that with respect to the Bach also, especially as we deal with more than two voices. If you're dealing with only two voices, there's no reason you ever have to give them the same rhythm. I mean, there's no reason in the world you should ever have to give them the same rhythm. So you can if you want, but it's easy to avoid. So Graham, I think, does a really good job of barely ever doing this, right? Is the only time in that first 4 bars when there's a whole beat of both voices having exactly the same rhythm. And it's just that one beat. But everywhere else, their rhythms are complementary in some way. And then that middle section here, really nice. Oh yeah. Right, so the rhythm, the eighths are distributed. One moves while the other one is not. There doesn't happen to be any passages of that kind of parallel motion in this piece. You can do that in a 2-voice piece, but when you do that, all polyphony goes away. As soon as you have 3 voices, though, it becomes really kind of cool to have 2 voices move together and 1 voice set against it. And we're going to see Bach going ham on that. So this has got the distribution of motion going. It's got the character of things going. It's got a lot of really good stuff going on. So the one thing that I'm always going to be commenting on is treatment of dissonance. And if there's one thing a point I want to make over and over again is have a plan for your dissonances. Most dissonances should be approached by step, resolved by step, and then there's special exceptions. And then if you're going to use a dissonance that isn't either approached or resolved by step, you want to understand, well, what am I doing with this thing? For instance, let's temporarily flip back to the piece we were just looking at. And do I remember where that is? No, of course not. Right here. In that version here, when I got to this, and then talked about leaping up here, yes, I'm leaping into a dissonance, but there's a plan for it. That's octave displacement. It's really stepping into the dissonance and then displacing it by an octave, right? So there's all that when I talk about having a plan, well, that's one of them. Octave displacement is a perfectly good reason to leap into a dissonance. The idea that sometimes leaps into dissonance is just because you want to call it you want to have an appoggiatura and you want to think of it as such. That's fine too. It's not saying you can never leap into dissonance. It's saying don't do it willy-nilly without thinking about why you're doing it. So I want to talk about a couple of the dissonances here that are not treated in that way of stepping into and stepping out of, and see if we can think of. And Graham, feel free to weigh in on what your thinking was here. Most of the dissonances, right? That's a neighbor tone, perfectly fine. Again, neighbor tone. Then, now we have a dissonance at the end of this measure that then neither voice is stepping out of, right? So the top voice is leaping down a third, bottom voice is leaping up a third. So neither voice is moving by step. So we have a dissonance that isn't resolved by step. It is, however, approached by step, right? So there's a concept that we hear about occasionally that I talked about, Sora. I know you're probably all ready to jump on this and point out that this could qualify as an escape tone. The idea is we have a consonance, and then we kind of step away from that very briefly. I use the example of leaping out a window to escape a burning building. And I don't know why that's the best example. That always comes to my mind, but it is. If you're in a burning building and you want to leap out the window, your goal is to go lower, right? You're going to fall, you jump out the window and land on the ground. You're going to land somewhere lower than where you started. But your first act of leaping is a slight leap up to make it out the window, and then you fall down. So it's your basic motion is from here to there, but in order to do that, you just did a little ba-yum, right? Ba-yum, and a little up and then down motion. So or the other way around, a down then up motion. That's less common. And so in this case here, if the rhythm had been the other way around, if the F sharp had been long and the E had been short, I absolutely would have heard it that way. So let's try that again. If I try that, if I wanted to think of the F sharp as kind of the important harmonic note, and then the E is just that little escape, this going to here makes total sense, right? This is like a D chord going to a G chord, and the E would just be that escape tone. Now, as it is, the F sharp is a short enough note that I'm not sure that I hear it that way. I don't hear F sharp as the important harmonic tone, which would then make E the escape tone. So as it is, the E kind of feels a little unresolved, right? We come down to this, and it's a dissonance, and then we just sort of leap into another chord. So then I start looking at it harmonically and say, well, if I look at this chord, E, this chord here is like some sort of E minor 7 chord. Could I then see the next chord in relation to that? And the answer is yes, I can. So this is what I think makes this work. And so Graham, again, if you have a particular thought about it, let us know. But if I see this as basically an E minor 7 chord, this is still part of that same E minor 7 chord. And so what I feel like is I'm arpeggiating that chord. It is a little odd that I'm arpeggiating across the bar line, but the fact that the chord didn't really change there, I mean, yes, there's not an E here, so maybe this is really a G chord and not E minor, but my ear can still hear that E. And so I think in my mind, that is what I'm hearing that makes that passage work. I hear this as all just arpeggiating that E minor 7 chord until we finally reach a C chord at the end. So when you're arpeggiating a chord, that becomes a perfectly good excuse, a perfectly good reason to have a leap out of a dissonance, because because that leap, if you're going to have the seventh of the chord in your arpeggio, there's going to be leaps going out of it. So anyhow, this is what I mean about really thinking this stuff through, making sure that you understand what you're doing. Now, in this piece, it's only two-part counterpoint, so we don't necessarily have a harmonic context. Like Graham, I don't think you were likely thinking of particular chord there. But if you played it and thought, gee, this sounds okay, that's probably what allowed it to sound right. And yes, I absolutely could imagine that thing that I commented on about that rhythm, you wanted to get that rhythm in there, and I don't blame you. Now, check out if I'd done this. That could have been that same rhythm. Instead of this, it could have gone, and then you would have been leaping into that dissonance, but then stepping out of it, which would be a little more normal, because that would be an appoggiatura, and it would be short, right? And then that F sharp would feel like the harmonic tone resolving to the G. So this is what I mean when I say, look at something and say, well, if it doesn't fit the mold generally, does that mean it's wrong? No, but it does mean you want to look at it and ask yourself if it's doing what you want, and is there an alternative that gives you what you want? So if the goal is just to have the rhythm, and if anything bothered you about that dissonance not resolving by step, that's how I would have changed it. I would have gone, and then I would have said, oh, I got a solution. Again, I'm not opposed to what's there now. It works as an arpeggiation for me, but this is one of those things where when you see something that's sort of a little not quite fitting, you want to ask yourself, is there something else that would fit and still give you the rhythm you want? So I don't know that what I just did is better, but I thought was a nice little illustration of things. So what I'm going to do next is so there's a few other places where there's this, like here's another one here, and this one I'm going to launch then into talking about Bach in a second. Another neighbor tone, and then here we're leaping into this dissonance, but it resolves to this consonance really quite nicely and sounds really good. Again, we have a dissonance at the end of the measure that then we leap out of, and again, I could totally hear that as all E minor 7. And I'm just kind of playing with that E minor 7 chord and hear it that way and not have a problem with it. So if you're only dealing with two voices and you're not trying to think about harmony, maybe you don't use that line of thought, but it's a valid line of thought, especially as we add voices, to be thinking about, well, what is the harmony being formed by these multiple voices? Even if there's only two voices, it's probably implying something. But as soon as you get to three voices, it's definitely going to be suggesting something. So what I'm going to do next is look at... Actually, I'm going to flip over to MuseScore for it. Look at this. Wait a minute. In D major. No, I don't want the D major one. I want the F major one. This is the F major one. So we're just going to look at it here. So Sora is asking about appoggiaturas in the middle of a beat. Appoggiaturas can happen anywhere, and appoggiatura again is a note that isn't prepared by step, so it's either you leap into it, or it's like the first note of the line, so it's not prepared at all. It's preceded by nothing. So an appoggiatura can appear anywhere. There's places where it feels most appropriate, and it's good to kind of collect them, be on the lookout for them, and notice where they get used. Most people describe appoggiaturas in terms of being accented, so like they're on the beat. But no, there's plenty of unaccented appoggiaturas too. So I would just I wouldn't worry about whether it's on the beat or not. But to go back to Graham's version, this is what I would call a classic accented appoggiatura. It's that would be an appoggiatura, and in Baroque notation, Bach, if he were writing it, might not have written the G. He might have just written the F sharp and then put the G as a little small grace note next to it. You'll see that pretty often. A little grace note with no slash through the stem. It doesn't mean, it means you play it. He's just telling you it's an appoggiatura, and that is a common way that Baroque composers would write appoggiaturas. They would write the main note on the beat and then put the appoggiatura like it was a grace note to indicate, yes, you're going to play it on the beat, but it's not the harmonic note, so I'm not going to write it normally for whatever reason. It was a silly convention, and people dropped it a couple hundred years ago. All right, so we're now going to look at this Bach three-voice piece and talk about this a little bit. So I made the observation, and so the thread on this, I totally recommend that you all go check that out. It's someone might want to put the link in the chat if you can, the link to the discussion about this, because I just want people commenting about individual measures about it and individual things. And I said let's just focus on the first 7 measures. The first 7 measures takes us up to this cadence here. So I'm going to play it. I'll let MuseScore.com play it, and then I'll play little sections of it myself. So let's hear this thing. So that's as much of it as we're going to be talking about today, because I want us to be able to focus and really get inside everything that's going on and not get overwhelmed. I mean, the piece is only like 20-something measures long, so we'll eventually get to talk about the whole thing. But let's focus just on things that we can find in those first few measures. So I want to make a comment here about the 2-voice counterpoint, because the first measure is only 2 voices, right? Right? Only 2 voices until the second measure. So if I look at this, 5th, 3rd, 6th, 5th, right? All consonances. Here's a 4th on the beat. So it's an accented passing tone. It's not accented literally, but it is accented by the little ornament. But it's on the beat. That's what we mean by an accented note in the context of counterpoint. It doesn't mean literally like there's an accent mark on it to play it loud. It means it's in a strong metric position on the beat. So a dissonance there because it's a 4th against that F, and then it resolves to a consonance, and that line ends with this little bit of dissonance here, this G against the F, and then it's being leapt out of. So this is very akin to the situation that we were just talking about on Graham's piece, where there was a leap out of a dissonance and trying to make sense out of it. And here, here is what I had said about it, and y'all can let me know if you see things differently. But if I look at beats 2 and 3 together, and think of that C as a passing tone and that A as a passing tone, this is a G minor 7 chord, right? It's a 2 chord that happens to have the 7th in the bass, and it resolves to a 5 chord, right? So I'm hearing this harmonically as that, as G minor 7 going to C7, 2 going to 5. And in that case, the G is not the dissonant note. That's what I'm going to get at here. If we think about it harmonically, this is a perfectly consonant triad. The F is the actual dissonant note. It's not obvious that it's the dissonant note because it starts off consonant against all its friends here, right? And it's consonant over most of these notes, but by the time we've outlined that triad, I can now say, F is the 7th of that chord. It's the one that needs to move by step. And it does, down to the E. So thinking harmonically helps you understand which is the note that really needs to resolve. Yes, in many cases, dissonances, both notes move by step, but not always. And it's it's often a case of deciding which one needs to move more. And if I have a seventh chord like this, it's the seventh that needs to move by step. Yes, it would have been nice for the G to keep the common tone from here to there. Keep the common tone. That would have been nice, but his line wasn't doing that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with going from root, root to root, root to root. Nothing wrong with that little leap, root to root, if we think harmonically. So even though there's only two voices here, I think that type of harmonic thinking helps all of this make some amount of sense. And then, yes, the question is, could you think about escape tone? But again, if you look at this rhythmically, if I just play this line, do we really think A is the most important note? Like this is the safe bed that you were sleeping in before you jumped out of that burning building? I think not. I think that's the least important note in that entire measure. So I don't think of this A as the safe ground we started from and then did a little leap, did a little escape tone business out of it. So it's really important that to get the idea that an escape tone is a brief moment between safe in bed and safe on the ground. Again, I'm just going to keep with that fire escape analogy. So safe in bed, good solid consonants. Safe on the ground, good solid consonants, with just a tiny little dissonance in between it. And that's not the case. This A does happen to be consonant, but it's just not, it doesn't strike me as an important note. So it feels like that's the passing tone. I hear this, that triad, and that C and A as passing tones, even though the A happens to be consonant. They are still passing tones within the context of the triad. So, and yes, thinking of it as a B-flat chord is definitely a B-flat chord, but then we still have to explain the G somehow. So once the G gets there, I feel like it redefines itself as a G minor 7 chord. And that's the thing, the 2 chord and the 4 chord are often going to have that relationship. The 4 chord B-flat and the 2 chord G minor 7. If you play it as a 7th, it has that 4 chord within it. So this ambiguity between 2 and 4, similar ambiguity between 1 and 3, you're going to see this all over the place, especially when you only have 2 or 3 voices and all chord tones aren't present. You're often going to have situations where, is that a 2 chord or a 4 chord? And then, well, does it matter? Either way, it's going to 5, right? It's going to 5. So at some level, it doesn't matter that much. But it does help us understand between that F and the G why it was the F that felt like it needed to move by step and why the G didn't. That tells me that Bach was probably thinking of it that way. So let's take a look. So if he had left out the G, if he left it out, I would have felt differently about it. Absolutely, Graham. So I wouldn't have been as interested in the melody because then that A, then coming back to an A feels a little odd, right? It feels like we come down to an A, then we come right back down to that A, and it feels a little disappointing compared to there's a motion from B flat to G that eventually, and then back up to B flat, and then it kind of surrounds the A. That kind of thinking about that line and where the top and bottom note is and where they're converging to, that's kind of an important subtle consideration that I would say that Bach is thinking about. So yes, if he had stopped it on A, I would be thinking about it differently harmonically. I would be just thinking of it. I would be thinking of it as a different chord, a D minor chord. But I wouldn't like the line as much. So, and then that D minor going to C wouldn't make me as happy as 2 to 5. Makes me way happier, right? So, That, yeah, circle of fifths is always going to make me happy. 4 to 5 is also going to make me happy. So, B flat, G, A, B flat. Oh yeah, if that line had gone, yeah, that would have been a brilliant line too. Whoops. That would have been a lovely line also. So, luckily, Stephen has now inadvertently led me back to the thing that you were all supposed to remind me of and didn't. What were the thing you were supposed to remind me of? The thing you were supposed to remind me of is rhythmic distinctiveness once we got to the Bach example. Even though this piece is nothing but 16th and 8th notes, that rhythm is distinctive, right? First of all, the rest and then 2/16 going into the 2 A's, ba-ba-bum-bum-bum, ba-ba-bum-bum-bum, is distinctive. I'm not saying it's like, oh, no one's ever written that rhythm. Of course they've written that rhythm before. There's only so many rhythms you can write. But yeah, it turns out to be a little distinctive. And then again, this line, if I ignore these two, the D and the C here, check this out. That's what's really happening here. Ba 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 bum 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 bum. And it's a very simple little line. It's a really simple little line there. It just happens to have this extra little decoration in there. So that distinctiveness of that rhythm is part of what makes a piece like this work. And so hold on one second. I mentioned I have to check a text at some point, and I just okay, good. All's well. So, I will keep this open just in case another thing comes in, but the thing I was waiting for came in. Everything's fine. I think I will be in the new studio location next week. Anyhow, so that distinctiveness is really important because what happens in contrapuntal textures like this is you've got so many different things going on. I mean, by the time we get to this third measure, there's 3 different rhythms. Right? There's 3 different rhythms. And right, all these different things going on at the same time rhythmically, and it's hard for the ear to sort out what's happening, but maybe you noticed at that time that basic line here happens again right there, right? And that same basic line happens here, just transposed a bit. Right? So that's imitative counterpoint. And we'll be talking way more about imitation. That's the next section of the course. We'll talk about techniques for imitation, the forms that involve imitation, and so forth. But the key point is here, once the texture gets really cluttered up like this, how are we going to recognize when some new voice comes in with a theme? The trick is you make it distinctive. Somehow make it distinctive. So listen for this now. We're going to play this again and just see how many times you hear that. Every time you hear that little figure, you're like, oh, there comes that little motif again. Check it out. Now, ba-da-dum, boo-doo-dum, that ba-da-dum, he's like giving us little fragments of that motif. Not da-da-dum, bum-bum, but just boo-doo-dum. But can you hear that it's related? This is what we talk about with distinctiveness, so that even if you just use those first couple notes, somehow your ear perks up and go, oh, there's that thing again. Oh yeah, here it was again. Boo-doo-bum-bum-bum, in this measure right there, going into that measure. Oh, I heard it in the middle voice, right? Did you hear that? Starting right here. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, boo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-dum. Right? It's just sort of buried in the middle of that line. And then there it is in the top voice, and it's in the bottom voice. Top voice there, and then right here in the bottom voice. So and they're overlapping each other. This is called stretto, when you have that same passage overlapping each other where you don't even wait for one to finish. We're going to learn more about stretto in the next section of the course as well. So the point is, when you've got these busy textures, you want to make your lines interesting enough that they jump out. So coming back to Graham's piece, which I don't know if I still have that. Oh yeah, Graham's piece is right here. That line that was part of the original melody is distinctive, and so by reusing it in the accompaniment, ear immediately says, yes, it's that thing. I like it, right? So this idea of having something rhythmically distinctive, especially in imitative textures, so that you recognize when that motif has come back, is really important. But it's also, distinctive rhythms are inherently interesting. So even if you're not worried about imitation, the idea of having distinctive, interesting rhythms is important. So there were a number of other comments that were in this, and I'm going to totally recommend that everyone just go through, pick a measure, and see what can you tell me about it. Like, no one has talked about measure 4, I don't think. So let's take a look at measure 4, and I'm just going to play through it real slowly. All right, so we have 3 voices here, 2 F's and an A, all consonances, right? Next half a beat, those are 2 dissonances against that G, right? The G then chooses to resolve to the F. Now, if we're looking at this in species counterpoint terms, this is terrible, right? Dissonance, dissonance. The moving line is 2 dissonances. You wouldn't do that in a pure Renaissance species counterpoint context. You wouldn't write 2 dissonances against 1 note. But here again, it's important to ask ourselves, who's on first here? Which is the dissonant note? Is it these 2 notes that are dissonant against the G, or is it the G that's dissonant against these 2 notes? And if you look at what's going on harmonically, let's ignore the G for a moment. If we ignore the G, this is all a triad, an F major triad. G was the odd man out. So the G was the note not part of the triad. Therefore, the G was the note that needed to move by step. The C and the A didn't care if they moved by step or not that much, because they're all part of the harmony. So at this point, we're going to start thinking not just in terms of dissonance per se, but non-harmonic notes, non-chord tones, basically. Which notes are chord tones and which notes are not chord tones? This gets to something that Dave was asking about or commenting about earlier, that the more voices you have, if we literally think, because I did make the point that ideally you check every pair of voices. Is there a dissonance between this pair? Is there a dissonance between that pair? And make sure that all pairs of dissonances are handled. If you find a dissonance between two parts, someone's got to move by step. And yes, you could compare each pair of voices. So if you got 4 voices, you compare the top 2, the first and third, first and fourth. You compare the middle 2, you compare second and fourth, and you compare third and fourth. You compare every pair of voices looking for dissonances in theory. But in practice, you don't need to do that, because we know this crucially important fact that I have pointed out, that if you're going to have 3 or more voices, the only way to avoid dissonance is to make a triad. If you missed that lesson, you just learned the most important thing you're going to learn this month. If you're going to have more than 3 voices, if you're going to have 3 or more voices, the only way to avoid dissonance is to make a triad. Either a major triad or a minor triad, or in first inversion. Second inversion can also work if we acknowledge that this fourth on the bottom is possibly a dissonance, but if there's a bass voice below it, it's okay. So fourths, are special. But if I play this interval here, third, fifth, right? All consonants. If I play it in first inversion, a third, a sixth, and a fourth. And that fourth is not involving the bottom voice, so all consonants. So triad in root position, triad in first inversion, those are always your safe choices. So at any given point in a piece, instead of having to compare every single pair of individual notes between voices, we can just look for the harmonies and ask ourselves which is the note that's not in that harmony. So as soon as I recognize that that first voice, that first beat, is an F major chord, I know that G is the non-chord tone. It's the passing tone, and it's the guy that needs to get approached and resolved by step. So the counterpoint concept tells us that yes, there's dissonances and we need to resolve it by step. But who moves by step? You know, we're not talking about a cantus firmus where there's a clear, you're not going to change that note, but this other thing, you know, the other part is what you can fiddle with and it's going to have to resolve by step. We don't have this clear separation of roles between cantus firmus and something else. It's everything is under our control now, and so we want to understand which is the note we need to move. And if they both happen to move by step, that's great. All right, that's my observation about that first beat. Now here, consonants, dissonance, back to consonants, so that E is a neighbor tone. And then consonants, 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 consonants. And then here's another neighbor tone. Consonants, 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 right? So everything here was consonant other than that G, which was a passing tone, and those couple of little neighbor tones. And right, so we had a couple neighbor tones and that one passing tone we just had to sort out, you know, that the G was the odd man out, not the C and the A. Just because the C and the A are the moving lines, that doesn't mean they're the non-chord tones. You know, you want to figure out which is the chord tone. I want to just do a quick check of my other window to make sure I'm not missing any chat comments, because when I don't see any chat comments, it always makes me wonder. Okay. So, yeah, that's measure 4. There was a lot of talk about measures 5 and 6, and I'm going to, some of it got into like deep minutia of things, but I want to talk about one thing in particular because Kevin mentioned this, and I had noticed it also, because it really was pretty striking. Let me play this line, this measure really slowly. Now, I didn't hold that F on top, so I messed that up. Let me try this again. At this moment, we're hearing F and B together, right? We're hearing that F at the same time as that B. So we're hearing this F and B on the downbeat, on the right on the stroke of 3, going to E and A on beat 4. And the question is that like parallel fifths? So first of all, they're not parallel because this fifth is a diminished fifth and that's a perfect fifth. So unequal fifths is the term that often gets used for that. From a tritone, a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth. And depending on who you ask and what the context is, they'll either say, yeah, diminished fifth to perfect fifth is okay, but perfect fifth to diminished fifth isn't. But in a different context, it might be the other way around. Perfect to diminished is okay, but diminished to perfect, not okay. I don't even worry about remembering rules. I just ask myself, okay, this is a little suspect, and the question is, did I hear it as a problem? And when I played it super slow, I didn't, but part of that's because the F has died out. But when I play it, when I let MuseScore play it up to tempo, I kind of do hear that. I will say, my ear does pick that up and say, gee, that's a little bit odd. All right. I'm going to, yeah, I'm getting a call, but I'm gonna assume that I can just call back in a couple minutes on this. But I'm gonna wrap up and do that because I feel like I do need to turn my attention to these other matters now. So anyhow, There you go. I want people to be looking at this stuff and looking at these things. I want to make one other observation about this piece, though, before I let it go, and that is you expect there to be places where two voices are moving together rhythmically, and we get that sort of thing like right in this measure. Right? These two bottom voices are going, right? They have sixteenths together, and then they have eighths together, and then they have bump, ba ba bump together, right? So there's places where you do have that sort of motion, parallel motion, or parallel or contrary, but the same rhythm, right? You totally have that. We also have it right off the bat here in that second measure when the third voice comes in. Check this out. Right? For that 2.5 beats, the top voice and bottom voice have exactly the same rhythm. And they're all consonances, right? A sixth, and now thirds. Parallel, and then back to sixths. And then we end up with an octave. So that idea that we have parallel thirds, parallel sixths, and that happens when if you start off with sixths and you move together, you're going to have parallel sixths. But here, it's contrary motion, so it jumps from a sixth to a third. And then it's parallel thirds. And then contrary motion to get us back to sixths, right? And then parallel sixths. So parallel thirds, parallel sixths, and then with contrary motion to jump between them, you're going to have passages like that, and that's fine. You just end up with that one voice set against it. That middle voice is holding on to the long note while the other ones move. Bum. So one voice doing something unique while those two voices are moving together. And it was doing something unique, but staying out of the way, right? Long sustained note. So, yeah, that's a technique that when I talk about texture and varying texture, you can expect when you get to 3 or more voices, you'll have some passages where everyone has unique rhythm, other passages where maybe 2 people are working together in parallel thirds or sixths, and some places maybe where a voice drops out and you drop down to 2 voices again, like it happens in this measure here, measure 8, it's back down to 2 voices for a little moment, right? So we're going to get that sort of textural variety. So these are the comments, the types of things that I want all of you observing as well. All right, I am now going to wrap up because I need to now get back to the business of the rest of my my business here. So, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the comments and questions, and definitely, if you're still working on the species counterpoint exercises and projects, turn them in, and please, people, I love it that people are commenting on each other's work. Great, that takes, it's great practice for those of you commenting, and it takes some pressure off me, which is great too. Yeah, just keep that up with those exercises, but then, as soon as you have time, be sure to be diving into this section on 3 and more parts so we can be dealing more with these issues of harmony and texture and so forth. So, next week, I will be back here, and you'll see slightly different surroundings around me. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.